Few American states have shaped the nation's destiny quite like South Carolina. From the first shots of revolution to the last gasp of rebellion, from the height of plantation wealth to the depths of Reconstruction, this narrow strip of Atlantic coastline has been the stage for some of America's most defining moments. This is the story of a state that helped birth a nation, then tried to tear it apart, and finally had to rebuild itself from the ashes. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most complex and controversial chapters in American history. This isn't just a story about dates and battles. It's about people, principles, power, and the painful process of transformation. So let's begin where all great rebellions do, with growing discontent under distant rule. To understand South Carolina's rebellious spirit, we need to go back to its founding. Unlike the Puritan colonies of New England or the tobacco kingdoms of Virginia, South Carolina was different from the start. Established in 1670 as Charlestown, named for King Charles II, the colony quickly became the wealthiest in British North America. But this wealth came with a price, and it was built on a foundation that would haunt the state for centuries. By the mid 1700s, South Carolina had developed a unique and troubling distinction. It was the only British colony where enslaved Africans outnumbered free white colonists. In the low country rice plantations, the ratio was often 10 to 1. This demographic reality created a society built on contradiction. Immense wealth generated by brutal exploitation, elegant Georgian mansions surrounded by slave quarters, Enlightenment philosophy, debated by men who owned other human beings. The plantation elite who controlled South Carolina weren't just wealthy, they were some of the richest men in all of British America. Rice and indigo made fortunes. Charleston became a cultural capital rivaling Boston and Philadelphia in sophistication. The planters sent their sons to Europe for education, built grand homes, and cultivated refined tastes. They also cultivated something else, an independent streak and a deep sensitivity to any perceived threats to their way of life. When tensions began rising between Britain and the American colonies in the 1760s, South Carolina was among the most vocal in opposition. The Stamp Act of 1760 hit Charleston's thriving merchant class hard. Christopher Gadsden, a Charleston merchant and patriot, emerged as one of the most radical voices in the colonies. His yellow "Don't Tread on Me" flag, with its coiled rattlesnake, would become one of the most iconic symbols of American resistance. The Tea Act of 1773 brought South Carolina to the brink. While Boston got more attention for its Tea Party, Charleston had its own dramatic response. When British tea ships arrived, Charleston patriots seized the tea and stored it in damp cellars where it rotted, becoming worthless. It was a quieter protest than Boston's, but just as effective and just as defiant. But here's where it gets complicated. South Carolina's planters weren't fighting for universal liberty or human rights. They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen and their freedom to govern themselves, particularly in matters of taxation and trade. The irony wasn't lost on everyone. Samuel Johnson, the famous British writer, asked the piercing question, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? It was a question South Carolina would grapple with for the next century. When the Revolutionary War came to South Carolina, it came with a vengeance. The Battle of Sullivan's Island in June 1776 was one of the first major Patriot victories. Colonel William Moultrie and his men, fighting from a palmetto log fort, repelled a massive British naval assault. The soft palmetto wood absorbed British cannonballs instead of shattering. The palmetto would forever after be South Carolina's symbol of resistance. But the British learned from their defeat. When they returned in 1780, they came in overwhelming force. The siege of Charleston was one of the worst American defeats of the entire war. More than 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered. The largest American surrender until the Civil War. British forces occupied Charleston and much of the Low Country, and it seemed South Carolina might be lost to the Patriot cause. What saved South Carolina, and arguably the entire Southern campaign, was guerrilla warfare. Men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens turned the backcountry into a nightmare for British forces. Operating from swamps and forests, striking supply lines and isolated outposts, these partisan fighters kept the resistance alive when conventional armies couldn't. The war in South Carolina was particularly brutal and personal. Unlike the relatively conventional warfare in the North, the Southern campaign became a vicious civil war. Neighbor fought neighbor. Loyalist militias battled Patriot partisans. Homes were burned. Prisoners were hanged, and atrocities occurred on both sides. The Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780, where Patriot militia defeated Loyalist forces in a savage fight, marked a turning point. The British hold on the backcountry began to slip. By 1781, with the arrival of Continental forces under Nathaniel Greene and the continued pressure from partisan fighters, the British were forced to withdraw to Charleston. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, it was effectively over. The British evacuated Charleston in December 1782, and South Carolina was free, but it was a devastated freedom. The war had ravaged the state's economy, destroyed property, divided families, and left deep scars that would take generations to heal. After the Revolution, South Carolina helped shape the new nation. 4 South Carolina delegates signed the Constitution, including John Rutledge and Charles Pinckney. But even at the Constitutional Convention, the seeds of future conflict were planted. South Carolina delegates insisted on protections for slavery, including the infamous 3/5 Compromise and the prohibition on banning the slave trade before 1808. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1790 transformed South Carolina's economy and sealed its fate. Cotton, which had been difficult to process, suddenly became incredibly profitable. The demand for enslaved labor exploded. By 1860, South Carolina would have nearly 400,000 enslaved people, representing 57% of the total population. The state's wealth, power, and entire social structure rested on this brutal foundation. As the North began to industrialize and anti-slavery sentiment grew, South Carolina became increasingly defensive and defiant. Enter John C. Calhoun, perhaps the most brilliant political theorist the South ever produced, and certainly the most influential. Calhoun served as vice president, secretary of state, and senator from South Carolina. He developed sophisticated constitutional arguments defending states' rights and the institution of slavery. The first major crisis came in heat over tariffs, not slavery directly. Congress passed protective tariffs that helped northern manufacturers but hurt southern planters who had to pay more for goods and feared retaliation from their trading partners. South Carolina called these the Tariff of Abominations. Calhoun anonymously authored the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, arguing that states had the right to nullify or void federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. In 1832, a South Carolina convention formally nullified the Tariff Acts and threatened secession if the federal government tried to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson, himself a Southerner, was furious. He issued a proclamation declaring nullification treasonous and threatened to lead an army to South Carolina personally to enforce federal law. The famous toast exchange captures the tension. At a political dinner, Jackson raised his glass. "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun responded, "The union, next to our liberty, most dear." A compromise tariff in 1833 diffused the immediate crisis, but the principles had been established. South Carolina had asserted that states could defy federal authority. Jackson had asserted that the Union was perpetual and indivisible. These positions were irreconcilable, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they collided again. On December 20, 1860, delegates at South Carolina's Secession Convention in Charleston voted unanimously to secede from the United States. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union. Church bells rang, artillery fired salutes, and crowds celebrated in the streets. They believed they were following in the footsteps of their revolutionary ancestors, fighting for self-determination against an oppressive government. The Secession Declaration was explicit about the reasons. It wasn't about tariffs or abstract constitutional principles. It was about slavery. The Declaration specifically cited Northern states' refusal to return fugitive slaves and the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Within weeks, 6 more Southern states followed South Carolina out of the Union. In February 1860, they formed the Confederate States of America. In April, Confederate forces in Charleston fired on Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun, started by South Carolinians in South Carolina. On December 20, 1860, delegates at South Carolina's Secession Convention in Charleston voted unanimously to secede from the United States. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union. Church bells rang, artillery fired salutes, and crowds celebrated in the streets. They believed they were following in the footsteps of their revolutionary ancestors, fighting for self-determination against an oppressive government. The Secession Declaration was explicit about the reasons. It wasn't about tariffs or abstract constitutional principles. It was about slavery. The Declaration specifically cited Northern states' refusal to return fugitive slaves and the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Within weeks, 6 more Southern states followed South Carolina out of the Union. In February 1860, they formed the Confederate States of America. In April, Confederate forces in Charleston fired on Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun, started by South Carolinians in South Carolina. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1860, Confederate batteries surrounding Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison of Federal soldiers held out for 34 hours, firing back despite being outnumbered and outgunned. When their ammunition ran low and the fort was in flames, Anderson surrendered. Remarkably, no one was killed in the bombardment, but 2 Union soldiers died in an accidental explosion during the surrender ceremony. They were the first casualties of a war that would kill 620,000 Americans. The fall of Fort Sumter electrified both North and South. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more Southern states seceded in response. The war everyone had feared and few had truly believed would happen was now inevitable. Ironically, after starting the war, South Carolina saw relatively little fighting on its soil for the first 3 years. The state sent tens of thousands of men to fight in Virginia, Tennessee, and other theaters. South Carolina regiments distinguished themselves in battles like First Manassas, Sharpsburg, and Gettysburg. But the state itself remained largely untouched even as the war raged elsewhere. Charleston became a symbol of Confederate defiance. The city was under almost constant Union naval blockade and faced repeated bombardment and assault. But it held out. Union forces tried multiple times to capture the city, including a massive assault on Battery Wagner in July 1863, made famous by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first African American units in the Union Army. The presence of African American Union soldiers fighting in South Carolina had profound psychological effects. For enslaved people, these soldiers represented hope and liberation. For white South Carolinians, they represented their worst nightmare, an armed and organized black population. The war was becoming explicitly about slavery and racial order. Meanwhile, the Union blockade was strangling South Carolina's economy. Cotton, the state's wealth, couldn't be exported. Supplies couldn't be imported. Inflation spiraled out of control. By 1863, a barrel of flour in Charleston cost what a laborer made in months. The hardship on the home front was severe, and it only got worse. In early 1865, the war finally came home to South Carolina with devastating force. General William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh from his march to the sea through Georgia, turned his army north into South Carolina. Sherman's men had saved their particular wrath for South Carolina. This was the state that started the war, the cradle of secession, and the soldiers were determined to make it pay. Sherman's march through South Carolina was more destructive than even his famous Georgia campaign. His 60,000 men cut a swath 40 to 60 miles wide through the heart of the state. They destroyed railroads, burned mills and factories, and confiscated or destroyed food supplies. Plantations went up in flames. The very infrastructure of the plantation economy was systematically demolished. On February 17th, 1865, Sherman's army entered Columbia, the state capital. That night, the city burned. To this day, there's debate about how the fire started. Union soldiers claimed retreating Confederates set fires before evacuating. Confederates claimed Union soldiers deliberately burned the city. The truth probably involves both, along with high winds and chaos. Whatever the cause, most of Columbia was destroyed. Charleston, which had defied Union forces for nearly 4 years, fell without a fight, with Sherman's army threatening from the west and Union forces advancing from the coast. Confederate forces evacuated the city on February 18th. Union troops occupied Charleston the same day Columbia burned. The symbolism was powerful. The city where secession began, where the first shots were fired, now under federal control. The war in South Carolina was over, but the devastation was complete. The state's economy was shattered, its cities damaged or destroyed, its young men dead or disabled, and its entire social and economic system was about to be torn down. South Carolina had gambled everything on independence and lost. Now would come the reckoning. When Union forces occupied South Carolina in early 1865, nearly 400,000 enslaved people became legally free. It was a moment of jubilation and profound uncertainty. Freedom meant the end of forced labor, family separation, and legal bondage. But what did it mean in practical terms? Where would people live? How would they eat? What rights did they have? The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created to assist formerly enslaved people, established offices throughout South Carolina. They helped negotiate labor contracts, established schools, and provided food and medical care. But the Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, and faced intense opposition from white South Carolinians who saw it as an arm of federal tyranny. African Americans in South Carolina immediately began building institutions and asserting their rights. Churches, which had been restricted under slavery, flourished. The African Methodist Episcopal Church grew rapidly. Schools sprang up everywhere. There was a desperate hunger for education. Adults and children attended classes together, learning to read for the first time, learning skills that had been forbidden under slavery. But white South Carolinians were determined to restore as much of the old order as possible. In late 1865, the state legislature, controlled by former Confederates, passed the Black Codes. These laws severely restricted the freedom of African Americans. They required annual labor contracts, restricted where freed people could live and work, and created harsh vagrancy laws that could force people back into plantation labor. It was slavery by another name. The Black Codes backfired spectacularly. Northern Republicans were outraged. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over President Andrew Johnson's veto. These acts divided the former Confederacy into military districts and required new state constitutions guaranteeing African American voting rights. South Carolina would be transformed, at least temporarily. In 1868, South Carolina held a constitutional convention. Of the 124 delegates, 76 were African American. It was a revolutionary moment. Men who had been enslaved just 3 years earlier were now writing the state's fundamental law. The Constitution they produced was remarkably progressive. It established free public education for all children, eliminated property requirements for voting and office holding, and protected civil rights. For the next 8 years, South Carolina experienced something unprecedented in the South: biracial democracy. African Americans voted in large numbers, elected representatives at every level of government, and participated in political life. From 1868 to 1876, South Carolina sent 6 African Americans to Congress. The state legislature had an African American majority at times. Prominent African American leaders emerged. Robert Smalls, who had been enslaved and famously escaped by commandeering a Confederate ship during the war, served in both the state legislature and Congress. Francis Cardozo, an educated minister, served as Secretary of State and State Treasurer. These men and many others proved capable and dedicated public servants. The Reconstruction government achieved real progress. They established South Carolina's first public school system, built hospitals and orphanages, and began rebuilding the state's infrastructure. They passed progressive laws and attempted to create a more equitable society, but they faced enormous challenges: a devastated economy, massive debt, hostile white opposition, and limited resources. White South Carolinians, especially former Confederates and the planter class, never accepted Reconstruction. They called it Black Republican tyranny, carpetbag rule, a nightmare. They were determined to overthrow it by any means necessary. The Ku Klux Klan emerged in South Carolina in the late 1860s. Operating in the upcountry counties, Klan members used terrorism to suppress African American political participation. They whipped, shot, and lynched African Americans and their white allies. They burned schools and churches. They disrupted Republican meetings and intimidated voters. The violence was so severe that President Ulysses Grant suspended habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties in 1870 and sent federal troops to restore order. Hundreds of Klan members were arrested, and the organization was temporarily suppressed. But the underlying white supremacist resistance remained strong. As the 1976 election approached, white Democrats in South Carolina adopted a new strategy. They formed paramilitary groups called the Red Shirts, named for their distinctive red battle shirts. Unlike the secret Klan, the Red Shirts operated openly, riding through African American communities in shows of force, disrupting Republican meetings, and making clear that any African American who tried to vote faced violence. Wade Hampton, a former Confederate general and one of South Carolina's wealthiest planters, led the Democratic campaign. He promised to respect African American rights while simultaneously unleashing the Red Shirts to terrorize voters. It was a cynical combination of public moderation and private violence. The 1976 election was marked by massive fraud and violence on both sides. Both parties claimed victory. South Carolina had 2 rival governors and 2 rival legislatures for months. The dispute mirrored the contested presidential election between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. The crisis was resolved Through the Compromise of 1877, Hayes became president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Without federal protection, the Republican government in South Carolina collapsed. Wade Hampton became governor, and Democrats regained control of the state. The end came quickly. African Americans were systematically removed from office through intimidation, fraud, and new laws. The biracial coalition that had governed South Carolina fell apart. By 1895, a new state constitution effectively disenfranchised most African American voters through literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements. The brief experiment in multiracial democracy was over. What followed would be called redemption by white Southerners and the beginning of Jim Crow by historians. South Carolina would remain under one-party Democratic control for the next 70 years. African Americans would be legally segregated, politically powerless, and economically exploited. The promise of Reconstruction had been betrayed. So what do we make of this history? South Carolina's story from rebellion to Reconstruction is complicated, tragic, and deeply important. It's a story about the limits and possibilities of democracy, about the terrible legacy of slavery, and about how societies change or resist change. The first rebellion, the American Revolution, was fought for liberty, but it was a selective liberty that excluded most people. South Carolina's revolutionary leaders fought for their freedom to govern themselves while denying that same freedom to the hundreds of thousands of people they enslaved. That contradiction would haunt the state and the nation. The second rebellion, secession and the Civil War, was fought to preserve slavery and white supremacy. This isn't a matter of interpretation or debate. The secession documents are clear. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected slavery, and the leaders said so themselves. The lost cause mythology that later romanticized the Confederacy as fighting for states' rights or Southern honor was a comforting lie, but it was still a lie. Reconstruction represented America's first serious attempt to create a multiracial democracy. For a brief moment in South Carolina, it seemed possible. Schools integrated, black and white legislators worked together, African Americans voted and held office, and progressive laws were passed. It was imperfect, often corrupt, and faced enormous challenges, but it was also remarkable and revolutionary. Why did Reconstruction fail? There's no single answer. The federal government's commitment wavered. Northern voters grew tired of Southern problems. Economic depression in the 1870s shifted political priorities. But the fundamental reason was white Southern resistance. People who had held power for generations refused to share it. They used violence, fraud, and legal manipulation to restore white supremacy. The failure wasn't inevitable. With sustained federal commitment, with land reform that gave freed people economic independence, with consistent protection of voting rights, Reconstruction might have succeeded. But those things didn't happen, and the moment passed. The consequences shaped the next century of American history. The Jim Crow system that replaced Reconstruction lasted until the 1960s. It took a century and another great movement, the civil rights movement, to begin fulfilling the promises of Reconstruction. In many ways, we're still dealing with the unfinished business of that era. What can South Carolina's story teach us today? First, that democracy is fragile and requires constant protection. Rights can be won and then lost. Progress can be reversed. The arc of history doesn't automatically bend toward justice. People have to bend it. Second, that economic and political power are deeply connected. Reconstruction failed in part because freed people were given political rights, but not economic resources. Without land, without capital, without economic security, political rights proved vulnerable. This remains relevant today as we think about inequality and democracy. Third, that how we remember history matters. South Carolina, like much of the South, spent a century celebrating the lost cause, erecting monuments to Confederate leaders, and teaching sanitized versions of slavery and the Civil War. These memory battles shaped identity and politics. The recent debates over Confederate monuments and symbols are part of this ongoing struggle over memory and meaning. Finally, that transformation is possible, but difficult. Modern South Carolina is dramatically different from the South Carolina of 1865 or 1900 or even 1960. Legal segregation is gone. African Americans vote, hold office, and participate fully in civic life. The economy has diversified. The state has changed. But that change required decades of struggle, sacrifice, and determination. South Carolina's journey from rebellion to Reconstruction and beyond is a microcosm of America's larger story. It's about the tension between ideals and reality, between the promises we make and the promises we keep. It's about power, who has it, who loses it, and who fights to keep it or gain it. The state that fired the first shots of the American Revolution also fired the first shots of the Civil War. The state that helped write the Constitution also led the effort to destroy the Union. The state that saw slavery at its most entrenched also experienced Reconstruction at its most radical. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They're all part of the story. Understanding this history doesn't mean celebrating all of it. Some of it is shameful. Some of the people in this story did terrible things in defense of terrible institutions. But understanding it means grappling honestly with the complexity, recognizing both the aspirations and the failures, and learning what we can for our own time. South Carolina's story isn't over. Every generation writes new chapters, makes new choices, and shapes the future. The rebellions and reconstructions of the past inform but don't determine what comes next. That's up to the people who live there now and who will live there in the future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into South Carolina history, please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to explore. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and thinking about where we're going. See you next time. South Carolina's journey from rebellion to Reconstruction and beyond is a microcosm of America's larger story. It's about the tension between ideals and reality, between the promises we make and the promises we keep. It's about power. Who has it, who loses it, and who fights to keep it or gain it. The state that fired the first shots of the American Revolution also fired the first shots of the Civil War. The state that helped write the Constitution also led the effort to destroy the Union. The state that saw slavery at its most entrenched also experienced Reconstruction at its most radical. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They're all part of the story. Understanding this history doesn't mean celebrating all of it. Some of it is shameful. Some of the people in this story did terrible things in defense of terrible institutions. But understanding it means grappling honestly with the complexity, recognizing both the aspirations and the failures, and learning what we can for our own time. South Carolina's story isn't over. Every generation writes new chapters, makes new choices, and shapes the future. The rebellions and reconstructions of the past inform but don't determine what comes next. That's up to the people who live there now and who will live there in the future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into South Carolina history, please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to explore. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and thinking about where we're going. See you next time.